Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. This is part one of 2 episodes with Amy Gahran, the author of Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator, Uncommon Love and Life. We have a great conversation where she defines what it means to ride the relationship escalator, the difficult obligations it entails, yet privileges it also creates. We talk about what it means to step off the escalator into an unconventional relationship, which can be stigmatized, yet opens opportunities for remarkable living. We also discuss how relationship success should be defined, the difference between consensual non-monogamy and polyamory, and why quote-unquote sexual friendships is a better term than quote-unquote friends with benefits. Amy will return in part 2 where we talk more deeply about solo living as an alternative to the relationship escalator, and she helps me better define what it means to be solo. I hope you enjoyed the episode. It's a really good one. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Amy Gahran. Amy is a journalist, host of the blog solopoly.net, and author of Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator, Uncommon Love and Life. Coincidentally, we both live in Boulder and hail originally from South Jersey, and thus occasionally we slip and say wooder instead of water. Welcome, Amy.
Hi. How you guys doing?
Now, unfortunately, I'm not in Boulder currently. I'm on sabbatical, but I just thought it was such a coincidence. And we met each other. You sent me an email telling me about your work. I have no idea how you learned about solo, though. How did you learn about solo?
I think somebody mentioned it on Bella DePaula's Community of Single People Facebook group.
Oh, yes.
I'm pretty sure, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm a podcast junkie. I pick them up all over the place.
That's great. Yeah, the reason I ask, by the way, that person could have been me shamelessly promoting, although the reason why I asked is I've done very little promotion of this podcast and people keep finding it. And so I was curious about that. Well, Amy, you live a fascinating life. You're a journalist, but you have this really wonderful, fascinating book. And I think we should just start by talking about defining what is the relationship escalator.
Okay. The relationship escalator is something that everybody knows about, but nobody thinks about. And writing this book was a whole process of, yo, fish, there's this thing called water. You might want to think about it. And what it is a bundle of social norms that typically define how sexually and or romantically intimate relationships are quote unquote supposed to work in this society. It's a clear progression. It starts with you meet someone, you think they're hot, you start dating, you start having sex, you fall in love, you stop dating other people, you move in together, and then marriage, kids, death do you part. Yes. So it's a progressive, escalating set of steps. And the reason why it's the relationship escalator and not the relationship staircase is that because these are such powerful social norms that this is what, quote, a relationship is and how it's supposed to work, that it has a sense of its own momentum, that it carries you along because there are so many things in our society that support relationships working that way. Mm-hmm. And so it can feel like you're just getting carried along that escalator when in fact you're actually making choices every step of the way. And all of those choices have other options. So that's why the book is Stepping Off the Escalator. It's what are the norms that traditionally in what most Western cultures define an intimate relationship and how it's supposed to work, and what are people doing other than that?
Yeah, I think that one of the points that so first of all, I really love the metaphor because I like that idea of momentum. I also I don't know if you intended this, but it's not easy to get off an escalator. And
Ever try? It's fun.
And so, it's sort of like, you get on it and then there's this sort of feeling of commitment, like, all right, we're going to take this to some end.
Mm-hmm.
So you write in the book, I actually wrote this down. You said, while the escalator comes with steep obligations, it also offers many perks that can be difficult to achieve otherwise. So
Mm-hmm.
can you say a little bit more about that?
Okay. Well, to talk about perks, let's talk about privilege.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, privilege is an important issue in society, and it can come associated with many things. Sex and gender. So you could have male privilege or cisgender privilege if you, appear to be presenting with the gender that appears to conform with your biology.
Mm-hmm.
You can have race privilege. So white privilege is a thing. Another kind of privilege that people don't often talk about is couple privilege. And that is the idea that people who are coupled up in an exclusive, or at least exclusive looking intimate relationship that involves or is intended to eventually involve a fair amount of life entanglement and identity entanglement, being a couple rather than two people who happen to be dating each other.
Yes.
That those people and those kinds of relationships are intrinsically worth more, that they get more attention, veneration, support, and they get a lot of benefits. Now look at this. Legal marriage is effectively institutionalized couple privilege. People who are legally married get a lot of, legal, financial, tax benefits. They get favorable consideration on mortgages if they're buying property together. And it's
Social Security benefits, health, in terms of things like sharing health insurance, even decision making when it comes to health care and so on.
Social Security benefits in the U.S. I am not a married person. And if I were to die, my Social Security benefits just go back into the pot. If I was married to somebody, my spouse would automatically get my Social Security benefits.
Right.
So those are pretty stark privileges, and some of which are institutionalized. Housing codes all over the country get to define how many related adults are allowed to, or unrelated adults rather, are allowed to live in a single dwelling.
Yes.
And who gets to define who's related or not. A lot of that comes down to ties related to legal marriage.
Yeah, this comes to mind. I have this apartment in Los Angeles that is, all the amenities are shut down because of COVID currently, and they're not allowing guests. So the only guests that are allowed are family and caregivers. And so, if you have that special status as a married person, then you can have this guest come. Otherwise, you're not supposed to be having a guest. You're familiar with Bella DePaulo, as you know. She's done all this work on singleism. She was one of a previous guest.
She's awesome.
She's really wonderful in so many ways. In terms of identifying the ways that singles are stereotyped, or as you're saying, people who are not on the relationship escalator are stereotyped, are discriminated against. I think one of the striking ones that comes up in the book, and that I've seen for myself, I've experienced it firsthand. I think anyone who's solo and listen to this podcast has experienced this, is even outside of the written rules is just the special status granted couples in conversation, in invitations, in perspective, and so on. And this is something that you identified a lot with regard to this topic, yes?
Yeah. For instance, if you get invited to a wedding or an office holiday party and there's a +1, if you want to bring somebody other than a spouse or somebody that you've been in a fairly well-established sexually and or romantically intimate relationship, you're kind of going to have to explain that.
Yes.
Why? Who is this person? It's my best friend.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like they weren't necessarily important enough to be included in that +1. Yeah.
Yeah, that's you just see this. So sort of the assumption is this is where you should be headed, and so the hallmarks of an escalator relationship, monogamy. These are pulled from your book.
Or at least serial monogamy. Yeah.
Yeah, serial
One partner
monogamy.
at a time.
What's that? One partner at a time. That's right.
That you'll admit to.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Merging, so this idea that you might merge your possessions, your finances, your living space.
Your identity. When people start to think and act as a couple, as a unit.
Yes, the benefer kind of phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yes. This notion which you've already addressed of hierarchy or of importance, that this couple gets special status over that of two friends or something like that.
Yeah. So if you go to visit family at the holidays and you're not married, guess who's going to be sleeping on the cot in the laundry room?
Yes, that's right. And then this sexual romantic connection, which is, as we already addressed, typically considered to be monogamous. And then
where does that leave asexual people?
And yes, I actually have a forthcoming podcast. It's likely to come out before this one on asexuality, where I talk to an asexual activist, and the sort of special considerations that those folks have and the challenges that they have as a result of, just living an unconventional. Even though it's a sizable group of people, it's just not something that people talk about or can quite understand because it sits outside that norm. And then this idea of continuity / consistency, right? The idea is that you are together now and you continue together, as you said earlier, till death do you part.
Always and forever. So the only way you know if you're riding that escalator right is when somebody dies.
Right. That's the successful end to the relationship. Yeah. I think, my feeling, and I use this word a lot, which is overprescribed, so I actually don't have anything against a relationship escalator. I don't think it's a particularly good approach for me personally, obviously. I think it works for lots of people, but I think the issue is that there are, and as your book documents, many people who it's not the ideal system, and that they would be, even though there are perks, they are less happy. It doesn't suit them, and that there are kind of many alternatives to the relationship escalator, which I want to talk to you about. But one of the things that has always bothered me is the idea that the success of a relationship is defined by its length.
Yeah.
And so now, of course, I think that because I haven't had that 10-year relationship under my belt or something like that. And so when I go out on a date and I kind of get these kind of interview style questions from my date, which is, well, how long is your longest relationship? I find myself kind of chafing at that logic, which is that somehow my shorter relationships are somehow diminished in importance because they didn't cross some threshold that counts as long-term enough.
It's not duration in a vacuum, though.
Okay.
So longevity is one benchmark by which people often evaluate relationships as to whether they're good, healthy, important, committed, whatever, but not in isolation. The longest lasting relationship I've had that has been particularly meaningful and deep and committed in many different ways has lasted at this point 32 years. Okay?
Okay.
With somebody who I was married to for 12 of those years.
Okay.
But for a lot of people, they wouldn't even consider me to be in a relationship with that person anymore.
Yes, I see what you mean. And it's not even just because of consistency, but because of the actual institution of marriage.
Yes, correct. Because we got to the top of the escalator and then we jumped off. And for a lot of people, any departure from the escalator means a relationship is over or at least seriously broken.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Even though our relationship got much, much, much better after we got unmarried.
I love that idea. Yes. Now, I understand the logic in that question. in part because that question, what it does is it indicates that this person is interested in a escalator-like relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Because what they're trying to suss out with that question is, can this man commit to me in the long term?
Because they want the escalator, but since their thinking about it has been influenced rather than informed by absorbing social norms and saying it should look like this. So can we ask these sideways questions that will kind of get there without saying, I want a relationship that does this, 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 and this. Are those check marks on your list? That leads to a lot of confusion and misunderstanding.
So this is, okay, so what is your advice for me and for other listeners who get that line of questioning? Right, so it's sort of, I think I agree with you, it's sort of indirect, it's an indirect question.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's happening on a first date, a second date, it's happening on a phone call, perhaps you're getting to know someone that you've met on an app or something like that. I'm asking you now to move from description to prescription, if you're comfortable with that.
Right.
But how do you encourage someone, especially someone who, obviously someone who's interested in the escalator, at least in some way. What I find often happens for some people are, there's basically three groups of people. There's the people who are like, yep, definitely want this, and maybe they've considered alternatives, maybe they're not, but they're very clear about they want to get on that escalator as soon as possible and then ride it to the top. Then there's a group of people who are like, nope, not interested in that at all, for whatever reason that might be. Perhaps they've already done it and they've seen the mythology, they've already have a divorce or something like that. And then there's some people who are like, well, with the right person, I'm on the escalator. With a different type of person, I might have a friends with benefits kind of situation or something, something else that that might be even more unconventional. And so I would assume that what you would have to say depends a little bit on who those people are, but just assuming you're in either the group of I'm not interested in the escalator or I'm open to it or not, depending, how do you respond with those interview style questions?
Well, being a journalist,
Amy's smiling right now.
I flip it around. Being a journalist, I flip it around and I do the interviewing. I've encountered those situations, and let's back up and have a little bit of context on this.
Please.
Because remember, privilege is a very important issue here. Being on the relationship escalator or wanting that, or at least being open to that, is an extremely privileged social position because that makes you normal. Literally normal by conforming to social norms. And when something is normal, it's assumed that that's what everybody wants. Simply by mentioning or asking about anything other than what's normal runs the risk of stigmatizing you. It signals that you are or might well be somebody who is not quote unquote normal.
Yes, I can see that, yes.
Yeah.
And my case in point was how reluctant I was to launch this podcast.
Why?
I remember thinking like, oh, if I was launching a podcast about how outstanding marriage was, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. You know what I mean? But there was just something in me that was there was a bit of trepidation. I knew that this was non-normative. I knew that this was unusual. And frankly, when I was doing my sort of quote unquote competitive analysis on this, most of the single focus podcast assumed that being single was this sort of temporary sad state that needed to be overcome rather than celebrated.
Or a consolation prize that you had to learn to adapt to because you just didn't win.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it just didn't break your way. That's unfortunate, son. But my take on it, even though the approach is positive, like there's not much complaining that goes on this podcast. There might be some teasing and some satire, but there's not much complaining that goes on, in part because I see, for a group of people, solo living as an opportunity, as something to be, as I said, celebrated, to be remarked upon as something that's you're better off doing in some cases. And yet I still felt a bit of the trepidation, and for the reasons I think that you have identified, which is it's just different. It's non-normative to do that.
Right.
And as soon as you step outside of the norm, at best you get some curiosity from the people in the mainstream. And then sometimes you get this really very puzzling, bewildered,
that trepidation is what I've heard described as a disturbance in the force. And that's a very apt description because privilege is a force in society. It's an active force in society. It exerts pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And when you push against it, you feel it. It's like starting to swim against the current. You will feel the pushback from it. And the flip side of privilege is always stigma.
Mm-hmm.
And things that are not privileged are at best invisible and at worst seen as inferior or dangerous or threatening. And when you are stepping off into, stepping out of privilege land, out of the assumption that you are coming at things from a privileged position, which in this case would be seeking the relationship escalator.
Yes.
Nervousness you feel is internalized stigma.
Yeah, I think that's right. By the way, I have no regrets of doing this. It's actually been a really fabulous experience.
Yeah, and you're doing a great job at it. I've listened to several episodes. I like it.
Oh, you're so kind. The fact that I find myself so compelled to do it, and then I keep getting such good feedback, because I think that there are, when you think about it, well, you know this even better than me, Amy, as someone who's thought deeply, is the solo perspective is, gets so crowded out by fairy tales, by books, by movies, by TV, by the conversation around the dinner table, and so on, that there are the people who it resonates with don't really have a place to talk about it, to learn about it, to celebrate it.
And they are dying for it. So when you create it, they all come in. It's great.
That feels like the case for me.
Mm-hmm.
I've been really surprised by it, in part, as I was saying, that people seem to find the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And so
how would you answer the dating people? Okay, so here's how I handle those situations.
Thank you. You're tracking this conversation better than I am.
First of all, well, first of all, because it's a good question. It's a question a lot of people have. And I think the main way to do it is whatever makes you unique, that you feel as a strength, and that especially does not conform to social norms. Be out and proud about it.
Yes.
Be upfront. It never should be a question that you need to answer in hindsight. Mm-hmm. It should be, ideally, the people that you are interacting with, at least to the point of talking about going out on a date with somebody, you would have supplied some sort of information or clues as to, say, for instance, that you never want to live with somebody. You mm-hmm. never want to get married or blend finances. That gets a little tricky on the dating apps, at least the ones that don't allow you to write more than like 30 words in a profile.
Yes.
Yeah. And the ones that don't allow you to write more than 30 words in a profile are a lot less useful, because everybody tries to conform to one of two profiles. I am serious. I am looking to get on that escalator. I am ready and available and open for this. Or totally casual. Basically, we'll get together. We'll screw a couple of times and see ya. Move on.
Yeah, and I think that's unfortunate in part because, so first of all, some people are, depending on who the potential partner is, are happy to screw or happy to get on the escalator, right? So it doesn't do a good job of saying, well, let's get to know each other and find out what type of relationship might work well for us. Mm-hmm. I do agree with you. I think this idea of, first of all, the more apologetic you seem, well, as we know, no one wants to go out with someone who's mealy-mouthed, who doesn't know what they want, who's scared, who lacks confidence. And so,
well, some people do, and you really want to watch out for them.
That's fair. Okay, that's fair. You don't want to go out with the people who want to go out with the person who lacks confidence. But I do think it is important. I say this all the time to friends, to listeners, to anyone, is a really wonderful skill is to be able to ask for what you want.
Mm-hmm.
And now the problem is to ask for what you want is an act of vulnerability. It's an act of courage. But I think everyone's better off when you're good at asking for what you want, because then that person has full information to grant it or not grant it. And then certainly when it comes to these sort of negotiations or fact-finding that happen early on when you're getting to know someone, it's just fair for them to know what they're getting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I can answer this question about how I deal with that particular question, which is I straight up say to them, if you're looking for some big number, you're going to be disappointed with me. But I don't judge the quality of a relationship by the length of time. And I've had many, sort of shorter relationships that are incredibly meaningful, affectionate, fond. I'm fond of the person. We may still be friends, and so on. If you're asking me about my interest in having a long-term relationship, I can answer that question rather easily, and that is, I'm open to it with the right person, but I'm not exclusively looking for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking to avoid two states of the world. And so my avoiding two states of the world, one is I want to avoid a life where there are zero women in my life, whether that be meeting for coffee or something more serious. And I want to avoid a life where I'm married with children.
Mm-hmm.
And so
there is lots of room for that, by the way.
There is a lot in between.
There's a lot in between.
Yes, and then depending on who the person is, then it might be more casual, then it might be more serious, it may be monogamous, it may be non-monogamous, right? So for me, I'm just sort of open. I can be very happy having a nice coffee date or going on a hike with someone and having a nice conversation, and then thinking, oh, nice person, but not a good fit. Mm-hmm. I don't see that as a failure. That's right. A nice afternoon. That's a good afternoon. I'm happy to have that. Mm-hmm. Because I just like the presence of meeting new people and so on. But I do think that a lot of what happens is there's this kind of mainstream, whether it be on the apps or meeting the old-fashioned way. And then what your book does is you survey 1,500 people who are living kind of with unconventional relationships. Mm-hmm. And I
have 1,500 co-authors.
Yeah, 15.
and I quote over 330 of them in the book.
Yes, you have. I really love the quotes, because it's just, there's people, the folks who you quote, they speak so eloquently about their experiences, and so provocatively about their experiences. And so let's talk a little bit about those alternatives. Mm-hmm. Right. So these are largely people living off the relationship escalator. Maybe they were on it, they got off, maybe it was never right for them. Mm-hmm. And so these are folks who are sort of forgoing that privilege, those perks, who are willing to face some stigma for what
if they're out about it. A lot of them are in the closet about it.
Yeah, so when I had my conversation about asexuality, I was struck that asexuals may have a coming out experience. Mm-hmm. They come out asexual. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some alternatives to the escalator.
Okay, so let's talk about solo versus single.
Okay, can we hold that? Because I want to do a whole separate episode on that.
Okay, that's fine. But it's an important distinction that I'd like to at least foreshadow. Because solo is, you may or may not want to have intimate relationships. You may be open to having very long-lasting, very deeply committed intimate relationships, one or more, maybe more than one at a time, maybe just one at a time. But you don't want to entangle your life and identity mm-hmm. in a way that resembles the escalator. You don't want to get merged that way. Whereas single, the simplest definition of it is being in a state of not having any current specifically significant intimate mm-hmm. relationship. So that would cut out people who, say, are doing the living apart together thing,
Right.
where they might appear single, or people like me. I'm solo and I'm polyamorous, so I might have more than one partner at a time. Currently, I have two sweethearts, wonderful, been in relationships with them both for years. I personally wouldn't call myself single because I'm not unpartnered,
Yes.
but nobody's moving in with me.
Right.
But but making that distinction of solo versus single in and of itself is a way of stepping off the escalator.
It is. Let's table the rest of this because I want to go a little bit more deeply into that as like a whole separate thing, but I think it's good that we bring it up now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so can I start?
Go for it.
All right. So you use the term sexual friendships.
Mm-hmm.
I would have used the term friends with benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that does not meet the criteria for a relationship escalator.
What benefits? Health insurance?
Sexual benefits.
Because that's a code word. Benefits means sex.
Yes, I see.
So when I use the language in the book that I use to try to explain things, I try to be literal about it.
Yeah, that's fair. I think your term is more accurate. Although, I mean, I'm not saying friends with benefits is in any ways a good term, but my experience with this type of relationship, I've had a number of them now, is they are friendships. That is, this is not booty calls, right? This is not someone who just comes over for sex. This is someone who we do things together with. We go out, we go to museums, we go on hikes. We are in many ways doing the kind of things that people who date and couple, people on the relationship escalator do for fun. The difference being, and also we are intimate, right? So we have a sexual relationship on top of that. So it's not clearly a friend and it's not a booty call. It's this blending of the two. In those cases, some of which they went on for quite a long time, is we both know that this is not going to some next level, right? Mm-hmm. This is not going, we are not going to get married someday. We are not going to move in together. We know that this is sort of for now, not forever. Mm-hmm. And we're okay with it. Mm-hmm. But in many ways, it's indistinguishable from a lot of other dating kind of relationships in that thing. And so,
just a lot of times people don't really talk about it. They just kind of wing it, or they infer what's going on. And because really a lot of times people only have define the relationship talk when they're talking about whether we're getting on the escalator or not.
Yes, that's right.
Which is unfortunate because there's a lot of wealth and value and love and support that can be found in all kinds of relationships, including various kinds of friendships. And some of the deepest and most committed relationships that people have don't involve sex or romance, mm-hmm. but they get given the diminutive just friends.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my previous guest, David J., who we're talking about asexuality, David has these define the relationship conversations with his friends, with people in his life who are important to him. And
I do as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not something I've ever thought to do. I may express appreciation for my friendships, but the defining the relationship conversations, in my experience, have been largely for the navigating a relationship that involves some sort of sex, affection, romance.
Yeah, because the relationship escalator, if you are riding up it or you think you might be riding up it, or if you don't want to get on it, conversations about relationships that focus on are we doing this escalator thing or not often come down to expectations of mutual support.
Yes.
And it's like, if I get sick, would you be the kind of person who would help me out with that? Or if I end up broke and homeless, would you give me a place to stay? And those are conversations that are important to have. As we know right now, we're not just in the middle of a pandemic, but an economic depression right now.
Yes.
And we're over 20% unemployment in the U.S. right now. And a lot of people are trying to figure out, where is my support? Not only what's coming or not from government and employers, but also from the people in your life. Who can you really count on? Who's going to be there? And if you really only narrow that field to people that you have a certain kind of sexual or romantic relationship with, you're cutting off a lot of options for support.
I agree. Yeah, exactly. I don't want to have sex with someone in order to stay in their guest room. Mm-hmm.
That is something where people are often very shocked to feel that somebody that they had a very close connection with, a close friendship with, when they start opening up to them about something that's really hard, that person just backs away from them. And it's nice to have a conversation about, what can I turn to you with when you're not in the middle of a crisis?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. I can imagine people listening to this and thinking how intimidating it would be to broach that conversation with a friend. Like, they may be very comfortable having a DTR.
The disturbance in the force again.
Yeah, it is indeed.
It is. There's that trepidation, and that's where you realize that you have internalized the hierarchy that is part of the relationship escalator, that the only relationships that are important enough to discuss at all are the ones that are going to be riding up that escalator.
Yeah, I know I'm cut from a different cloth, because I always sort of, like, whenever I feel like a friend's slipping away because of a relationship, I always just go, they'll be back.
Right. But part of the hierarchy of the relationship escalator is that it's supposed to be acceptable that you can have really close friends and they will just disappear when they have a romance, and you're supposed to defer to that.
Yes.
You're supposed to accept that. And I'm not saying it's necessarily worth starting a war over, but I advise people to have conversations about that when you see that happen. It's like, excuse me, are you taking our friendship for granted here?
Yeah.
Because if you're just planning to unilaterally withdraw whenever you have a romantic interest, that is not something that I personally really want to feel very invested in.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's, my thing is, I want to support my friends' happiness, and I also understand enough about the early stages, right? The one thing about the relationship escalator that is worth mentioning is the role that love plays in it. That falling in love with someone has this sort of creates this sort of momentum and bonding that I think is, not only is it sort of fun and enjoyable and exciting, it is, kind of biological, emotional. It's sort of, it's something that's easy to kind of get swept up in.
But the impact of that is not universal. For instance, if you were to fall madly in love with somebody next week, would you stop doing your job? If you had a kid, would you stop feeding them and homeschooling them? Okay. In that situation, the hyper focus that people fall into, which a lot of people in the poly community and elsewhere call new relationship energy, because often it actually has very little to do with love. Okay. It is a phenomenon. It can be associated with love, but often it is not. It's its own psychological and physiological phenomenon that tends to create tunnel vision and emotional intensity. And that is strongly socially venerated and supported. For reference, see every love song ever written.
Yeah.
Okay? But so there is a lot of social context that says, when you feel that kind of emotional intensity and hyper-focus, A, that means love, and B, that means that relationship should take precedence over certain kinds of other relationships that, especially friendships.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've termed this the genital heart connection, right? You start smashing genitals together, and then it's just so easy for you to get wrapped up, in all the other elements of this connection.
But it doesn't even have to do with a mutual connection, because people lose their shit just as much over an unrequited crush.
Fair enough.
Yeah. But the difference is, though, when you have the social veneration of that this is a relationship that is mutual, and that you're both feeling that intensity, and that might at least have the potential to ride up that escalator, it suddenly becomes okay to just forget about everybody else, except, of course, your boss and your kids. So
yeah, this is well said. This is why I wanted to talk to you, Amy, because when I was reading the book, there were so many like really cool ideas, and these are ideas that don't get talked about at Thanksgiving dinner. You know, they're not even something that happens at, you know, dinner parties. You don't see, you're not, you know, it's just, there's not a lot of resources out there until you start digging deeper for them, right? They don't show up as in mainstream movies. Obviously, they don't show up in pop music, you know, and so on. So what are some more of these besides, so I brought up sexual friendships.
Well, so there's the idea. I was really surprised. So first of all, when I did the research for this book, I did a survey that basically asked people, there were several questions, but it boiled down to, do you consider your intimate relationships to be somehow unconventional? And if so, how?
Okay. So pretty open-ended question.
Pretty open. Yeah. It was like all big text fields, and wow, trying to analyze that data was, but I did it. And anyway, one of the I had some ideas about the norms that I thought identified relationships, the hallmarks of the relationship escalator. I mean, exclusivity between two and only two people. So monogamy, traditionally defined, is the 800-pound gorilla.
Indeed.
But also then things that are more subtle came out, like the single biggest, we've mentioned asexuality here. The single biggest surprise here that I hadn't in the data was all the people I heard from who are somewhere on this spectrum of asexual or aromantic, where they have deep, loving, committed relationships, but they don't have that mad rush of passion where you're like obsessing over somebody and want to sing them love songs all day. When I started hearing from more of them and the depths of their relationships and quite frankly, the frustration and disappointment they experience with so many parts of society by having their most valuable relationships intrinsically dismissed because they don't involve hearts and flowers or they don't involve fucking. And so that when you want to think really, really hard about relationships, take some of the assumed characteristics out of it. And sex and or romance is one of the most foundational characteristics of what often fits into that little code phrase in a relationship. Like if you don't have sex or romance, it's not really a relationship.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Yeah, and people who fall on the spectrum of asexuality or aromanticism have a really justifiable beef with the relationship escalator because their most treasured relationships don't fit, and even when they get established, they get actively undermined.
Yes. Okay. And so what are some of the ways that happened? So I think this is a very good one, right? Because essentially what you have is this checklist, you know, monogamy, check, merging, check, sexual romantic connection, check, consistency,
hierarchy,
check. Hierarchy, check, right? And so then what ends up happening is if you start deviating from one or all of those things, people start looking at you sideways, right?
Yes.
So if you were to say, if you were at dinner, you're at a potluck, and you say, "Oh yeah, my partner and I haven't ever had sex," right? Then people would want to know more because that seems so peculiar to them.
Or they might say, "Oh, so you're just friends, right?"
Yes, that's right. No, this is my partner though. And right, but I don't understand. How can you be a partner but not be romantically involved, right? That kind of a thing. Yeah. So let's look at these alternatives through each of these criterion, right? So for example, you've alluded to one already, right? So a deviation from merging, for example. So you have people who are partnered, but they live in different the first step is like they sleep in different rooms. The next one is they live in different residences. They live in different states. They live in different countries. You know, they have separate bank accounts. And so on.
Yeah. And so the opposite of merging is basically not just separation, but autonomy. The people retaining autonomy and individuality. People retaining their individual identity, not just merging their identity, subsuming it within couplehood, still being a me. The default is me, not we. So that would be the solo perspective. The coupled perspective would be the default identity would be we.
Yes.
And then also autonomy in organizing your life and making your own major life decisions. Like, for instance, just living in separate residences might still involve a fair amount of merging, because what if you had a married couple who lived in different cities, which happens quite often right now, and one of them decides they want to completely change their career. Well, they might still be very financially entangled, and a big career change could impact both their finances. There's probably going to be a joint decision as to whether or not you're going to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
I see what you mean.
So it's important when you're looking at the relationship escalator to look beyond the superficial characteristics and see the essence of what's going on there. And the opposite of merging is basically autonomy, being able to still call your own shots in your own life. That doesn't mean you don't care about anybody else, and it doesn't mean you don't ask for their opinion or take them into consideration. It doesn't even mean that you don't occasionally prioritize their needs above your own. It just means that you are not a default joint entity.
I see. Okay. That's great. We're going to revisit that a little bit when we get into the solo stuff a bit deeper with part 2.
Okay. Now, monogamy. Now, here's the thing. Okay,
this is the big one.
The opposite would be non-monogamy. Okay. Non-monogamy is actually incredibly common in mainstream society in a couple of circumstances. The first is somebody has not yet committed, however they want to consider committed, to a particular partner for the relationship escalator.
Yes.
So they might be intimately involved to some extent with several people. But that's just dating around. That doesn't mean you're not monogamous, because you still have the intention of someday finding, quote unquote, the one. And the one is something we can go on about for quite a while. But also there is non-consensual non-monogamy.
Yes.
Cheating, infidelity, which I think infidelity is an interesting term, because non-monogamous people are often doing that because they're being true to themselves. So is that infidelity or not? But anyway, to get out of the semantics of it. But cheating is so common, but it's actually kind of a hack for the relationship escalator. It's not really, it's the dark underbelly of the escalator.
Yes,
because
indeed.
When somebody hears that somebody has been cheating on a monogamous partner, they might be angry, they might be stunned, they might be shaming them, whatever. They won't be confused. They will know what that is. And there is a social script for cheating. The people who embark in non-consensual non-monogamy know, you got to keep it secret. You got to hide it around. And if you get caught, you either go off with the other person or you have to break off all contact with them. You know, there's a script. Okay. Now, consensual non-monogamy, which is a broad term that encompasses a lot of different forms of non-monogamy. It has the context of, we're going to make our own agreement about our relationship and whether this is exclusive or not, and what other kinds of relationships we may embark on. We might make those decisions about how we will engage in other people together, in which case you have a level of hierarchy where the couple decides what happens with other people.
Yes.
Or it may be as autonomous individuals, a more egalitarian approach where you might say, you know what? I love you. Let's keep doing what we're doing. This is fabulous. We may even live together. I'm really falling for this person over here, and I'm going to start spending time with them, and I might wish to, commit to them in my own sense. I may wish to maybe, shuttle back and forth between two homes and live with both of you, or maybe all of us could live together someday, if we all feel like doing that. But there is no roadmap for that.
That's right.
I think people are terrified by consensual non-monogamy because of the lack of a roadmap. How would this work? And
yes. So I want to add to what you're saying, because I Yeah, the complexity is not trivial. And it also is threatening, I think, in part because there's not a script. That is, what it requires is conversation and asking for what you want, which of course can be scary to do.
And a willingness to face no.
Yes, exactly. And, concerns about jealousy. There's always, the things about monogamy and the
right, because jealousy never happens in monogamy, right? It makes you automatically move to that.
No,
I've heard that.
No, but I mean, but the idea that you're inviting it, in a sense, I agree with you. Actually, I think that consensual non-monogamous relationships can be jealousy free, and monogamous relationships can be ripe, with jealousy. Like, it's not there's
jealousy is a human thing, and to some extent it's relationship independent.
Indeed. I agree with you. So this, and so there's all these different forms. So I have a previous episode. So we had called it ethical non-monogamy, which I made fun of. I think that's a funny term to me, right? There's no such thing as ethical monogamy. And so...
well, there is, but that's where you get the disturbance in the force again.
That's fair.
Because monogamy is assumed to be intrinsically ethical. But look how many people are coerced into monogamous relationships.
That's a good point. Yes. So this notion that you and a partner may agree on parameters for relationships with other people, I think I can see how, especially someone who's just kind of grown up and been socialized with regard to the escalator, would find that threatening, difficult, and so on, even if they also might find it liberating and exciting.
They've probably never seen any examples of it in their real life, except things that have gone wrong, because when things blow up, they're a lot more visible than when everything's smooth sailing. Yeah,
and because, right, so, you had the great advantage of being able to connect to people who are willing to talk about this, and then you're able to translate their insights. I think people who read your book are going to feel, look, I think some people are going to find it they're just going to throw their hands up and be like, no way, kind of thing. But the kind of person who listens to this podcast, I think could find these ideas exciting and liberating. I had a young woman say to me, text me, I'm listening to your ethical non-monogamy podcast and I'm taking notes. Because she had never come across this information before. She had never learned that there were alternative scripts.
Right.
To this.
And that is about, again, privilege and the disturbance in the force.
Yes.
The reason why I self-published my book is that I did talk to several publishers about it. And if it wasn't going to be a how to do relationships, they literally did not know what shelf to put it on.
Fascinating. And
they all tried to talk me into doing it as a how-to, or to talking about it in the sense of how unconventional relationships are better or worse than the relationship escalator. And it's like, no.
It's like, I like to say, like you can't say Indian food and Italian food, one is better or worse. It's some people like Italian and some people like Indian.
Right. But okay, so say if I was going to do a cookbook,
yes,
and it fell in some weird cross-genre thing, publisher would have figured it out. Because it's all in the food thing. But the relationship bookshelf in bookstores only fits into a pretty narrow subset of relationships.
I agree with you.
They work. Again, the disturbance in the force.
Right. Okay, so these so let's keep on talking about monogamy. So this idea of, and I think this came up in your book, this term monogamish, this Dan Savage term.
Yeah, he came up with that a while ago, and Dan's a really smart, great guy, and he knows a lot of things well. He's not necessarily the best resource on all forms of consensual non-monogamy, but he does know a fair amount about it.
I see. Yeah, so that struck me because I have a friend who says when he talks to potential partners, he says, like, I'm 90% monogamous. Like, I want to spend most of my time with you, but on occasion, I'd like the opportunity to be able
have
to
a special guest star. And that's a totally valid way to go about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that he knows about himself, and he's like, that ratio works for me, and he's good. He's unapologetic about it. He's good at communicating that.
Yeah,
And
but
so,
there's also a lot of fine print that goes along with monogamish. That term is usually meant to refer to a couple, usually that already lives together, but certainly has a well-established, otherwise monogamous relationship that occasionally has threesomes.
I see. Oh, really? I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, that's usually how that term is used.
I see.
So if your friend says they're 90% monogamous, but occasionally wants to go out on dates or away for a weekend or something with someone else, that
There's not a term
somebody
for
who
that.
said, yeah, it's like you need to talk about the fine print here.
Indeed.
You can't
I agree.
You can't just throw a broad label at it and somebody saying, oh yeah, I'm okay with it, because they might have their idea of threesomes cool, and that's not what you had in mind.
Yes, that's a good point. I think there's something that came up in the book that I thought was very interesting is, let's say a couple, it doesn't have to be a couple, has a consensual non-monogamous relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And then the idea is, you were sort of talking about autonomy, or it might be that the agreement happens between the two people, like that someone might have veto power.
Mm-hmm.
Over, like, yes, you can have sex with that person, I approve, or no, you can't have sex with that person, I disapprove.
Or you've been really involved with that person for 3 years, but I'm feeling insecure now, so you got to dump them.
Yes, I see.
Mm-hmm.
Versus someone says, you, as long as you practice safe sex and are discreet, do whatever you want to do.
And then it gets down to the fine print. What does safe sex mean?
Yes, exactly.
What does discreet mean?
Yes.
And does the other person involved, does their opinion count?
Yes. And I mean, my sense of this is that's something that these people need to figure out and negotiate and decide whether it works for them or not.
Mm-hmm.
Like, veto power is neither good nor bad. It's just good or bad depending on if it works or doesn't work for both people.
And as long as there's informed consent for the third party going in. You don't want to be surprised by veto power years into a relationship. That actually happened to me.
I see. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, in terms of communicating what your other relationship is and what are the rules.
But then we get back to the same issue, to circle back to what you were originally saying about how do you bring this up or raise questions about this when you're first starting to date somebody or figuring out whether you even want to try to date somebody,
mm-hmm.
is simply raising these questions. And this might be even further amplified in the context of a well-established relationship, that you might want something different than what you've been doing.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to change the terms of the agreement of your relationship. If those terms of the agreement of your relationship were all based on assumptions in the first place, and you thought you were both on the same page and maybe not quite, and you want to change that, and you suddenly want to start talking about things that are very much not socially sanctioned, that gets so scary. And people are so scared just to raise the question. And this is why I advocate that people clearly negotiate their relationships and keep negotiating, because people are moving targets,
mm-hmm.
I mean, even after decades together. So, if you want an option to be open, or if you want to take an option off the table, do it with discussion. Don't just kind of act like, well, we haven't done that, so we're not going to do that, right?
I think that's really good advice. What it's really built on is the assumptions, because there's a script for the escalator, you might never have these conversations to begin with. Mm-hmm. And then at some later point, you start wanting to have conversations and how threatening they may be,
mm-hmm.
versus you have a practice of having conversations with a partner about what you want, what you need, what your preferences are, asking them what they want, what they need, what their preferences are.
The more you practice that skill and do it on the low stakes stuff, don't bottle it all up and wait for the high stakes stuff,
mm-hmm.
the easier it is to have those conversations, and the easier it is to realize that change is not an intrinsically bad thing. In fact, if there is no change in a relationship, it is probably going to be pretty damn unhealthy, especially the longer it goes on.
Agreed. Just the nature of development, in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So the last thing I want to chat with you about is, and So I'm often surprised at the lack of knowledge that people have about non-monogamous relationships. For example, people will interchangeably use the term polyamorous and non-monogamous, not recognizing that there are substantial differences there. And so could you give kind of a primer on those differences? Because now we're talking unconventional. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating about your book, and especially because you have all these really vivid quotes, are the variance in terms of people's relationships. Someone's like, I'm the hinge in a polyamorous relationship. On the side, I'm a sex slave to this thing, and on occasion we'll do X, Y, or Z, right? You know what I mean? In this kind of way, versus someone who has a partner and occasionally might go to a sex club or swing and so on, right? It's a big menu to choose from, Amy.
Yeah. Well, okay. So it kind of breaks down this way. First of all, everybody involved, in order for it to be consensual non-monogamy, everybody involved has to be aware of and agree to that it is that kind of relationship. If you are in a relationship that began as assumed, ostensibly monogamous, and then just start seeing other people and then figure, oh, well, I wasn't keeping it a secret and you should be okay with that. That's not consensual non-monogamy.
Not at all, yeah.
That's being a shithead. But people do that, and they do that a lot. So assuming that relationships can be non-monogamous, non-exclusive, either for sex and or romance by consent, the first thing to realize is that this is not about couple plus. Okay? Non-monogamy isn't something that couples do. It's something that people do. So that's the first issue. So for instance, I am solo. I am also polyamorous, and I engage in relationships to various levels of intimacy with people with whom they want to engage that way with me.
Okay.
And but I make those decisions about myself, and I don't really consider myself to be a couple. I just have people that I love and am close to and committed with. All right. Then there is partnered non-monogamy, which comes in a variety of ways. Now, this is couple plus. This is where it is about, it's an intrinsic hierarchy where there is an established couple, or maybe three people in a triad or whatever, that agree that they will in some way engage with other people, but those are literally outside partners. Okay. That they are relationships that are either lesser than or apart from the established core relationship.
Okay.
And that's where the issue of hierarchy gets very emotionally and ethically dicey, because people develop feelings and people develop senses of commitment, and relationships don't always go the way you might say, this relationship is going to stay in this box. And how well does that work out?
Right.
But the way some people deal with the uncertainty that's associated with how relationships may develop is that the way people deal with relationships that might have that level of uncertainty is that they put very clear constraints around it. For instance, monogamous couples, where we will occasionally have a special guest star in our bedroom for a threesome.
I see.
Okay. And this is just a sex thing. And, they may be a friend. We might socialize with them, whatever, but this is occasionally a thing we do for fun.
Okay.
Swingers are more organized around that. And that is a very couple-centric approach to consensual non-monogamy, where it's often very heterocentric and cisgendered. So we're mainly talking about opposite sex couple, cisgendered, and usually it is the women are open to having sex with people of a variety of genders, but the men are really not into touching anybody's dick. So, but they are are very, very careful and very good about negotiating rules and boundaries of how they will engage either in a specific situation or if they have people that they swing with on a regular basis, how that will work. If I ever ended up in a major contract dispute, I would want a highly experienced swinger as my lawyer because they know how to negotiate and say, this is what the agreement is. And yeah, so that's cool. And they would get a solution. It wouldn't just be war in the courtroom.
Yes.
Swingers are very good negotiators. And then there's polyamory. And polyamory is basically you are open to having more than one intimate relationship at a time, where more than one of those relationships at a time can develop some level of emotional depth and commitment.
Okay.
Okay. And potentially life entanglement. Okay, so for instance, if I'm polyamorous and I have two people that I'm involved with in a sexual and intimate way, in a long-term committed way, and that doesn't mean that I can't also have other types of relationships. It can't mean that I don't necessarily have a fuck buddy,
Okay.
over there, or that I might not do a one night stand or something like this. All of those kinds of interactions can happen under polyamory, but the difference with polyamory is that you are open to the potential of depth and commitment and perhaps entanglement, if that's your thing, with more than one partner at a time.
I see. Yeah, one of the things that struck me about some of the stories in the book was, I mean, obviously when you step off the escalator and you have a better chance to meet your needs, obviously, but it also can introduce complexity. And not that complexity is bad, but it can introduce it.
And monogamy is not complex at all, right?
No, but what I'm saying is...
No, but this is important because people assume that non-monogamy is more complex. That is not necessarily so.
Okay, well, I may push back on it. I always like to say is that the monogamy or the escalator is simple but difficult. That is that, just because, it's this one path doesn't mean it's an easy path to walk or stand, to make the metaphor work. But
if I agreed to be in a monogamous relationship and realized that as I started to get close to other people that I had to cut those relationships off at a certain point, that's a lot of complexity for me.
That's fair. Amy, I really actually appreciate talking to you because I like to think of myself as fairly progressive when it comes to these kinds of ideas. And this conversation is revealing even how I have somewhat kind of assumptions, and the water around me at times, I don't even notice it. So I actually really appreciate that.
Yeah, maintaining the boundaries of monogamy requires a fair amount of effort.
I agree. I'm not saying it's easy. I think it's actually really hard. To me, this is an important episode. We're actually gonna wrap up here. We're gonna come back with part 2 where we dive a little bit more into the solo stuff. Okay. To me, for some people, this is the first time they're ever getting this view.
Do you think I scared them yet?
No, well, I think for some people it's scary, and I think for some people it's really exciting. I think it is liberating to realize that you are a fish in water. You know what I mean? Like that most of us really are seeking truth and seeking an insight. And if you don't feel like the escalator is the right thing for you, to know that there are A, alternatives, B, a surprising number of people who are pursuing those alternatives. You just don't know about it because they're not able to have a conventional conversation about it because of the stigma. And then you can start to learn some of the skills that are necessary to be able to navigate this kind of brave new world. I think that this conversation is a good start in this direction.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. And the escalator really is a wonderful option for a lot of people, and it works very, very well for some people I love. But I think it's useful to know about options, not only because the escalator may not work for you, but try as you might end up falling off it. And if you fall off the escalator and feel absolutely bereft and desperate to jump back on as soon as you can, just to feel normal and respected and adult again, you are going to make a bad mistake, most likely.
I agree. I think that that's right. If you're not well tuned for it, then to keep going back to it is a real problem.
Well, and even if you are well tuned to it, be able to exist without it if a good opportunity, if the right person, but somebody who's a really compatible partner for all the aspects of the relationship escalator that matter to you. Rather than dive in with somebody where you're going to have big, big trade-offs for the rest of your life, be willing to hold your ground for yourself. And that's something that anybody can learn from having substantial adult experience of solohood, even if you don't want that to be the choice for the rest of your life.
Amy, I'm going to end with that. That is so well said, and it's a perfect segue into part 2. So I hope people will come back to solo for part 2 with Amy Gahran. Amy, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Peter. I appreciate your work.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.org. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.